The wind howled, scattering brittle leaves across the barren grounds of Blackwood Asylum. The sprawling, ivy-clad building lay just beyond the veil of trees, hidden from sight as if the forest itself wanted to forget it existed. It was a place few dared to venture near, much less approach after dark. Nestled in the mountains of Pennsylvania, Blackwood had been abandoned for decades, shrouded in tales of strange happenings, spectral sightings, and disappearances. Among the locals, Blackwood was infamous, spoken of in hushed whispers as a place that attracted darkness. In the late 1800s, it had been the largest asylum in the state, its rooms and corridors teeming with patients afflicted with all manner of mental illness. But rumors of grotesque experiments soon surfaced, tales of doctors pushing the boundaries of science in pursuit of cures that twisted flesh and minds alike. Many patients vanished, said to be transferred to other facilities, yet no record of their departure was ever found. Eventually, after a fire consumed much of the East Wing and took with it countless lives, the asylum was closed. Locals claimed to hear strange noises emanating from the ruins, a cacophony of screams and murmurs carried on the wind. The legend only grew with time, becoming something of a rite of passage for local teens. Spend one night in Blackwood Asylum, they would dare each other, usually choosing Halloween to up the stakes. Yet, few returned the same. Most who dared the asylum reported feeling uneasy, watched, and some were left with claw-like scratches on their skin, as though invisible hands had reached out from the darkness to mark them. So when Jacob Wilder, a well-known local, paranormal investigator, and YouTuber, announced his intent to live-stream from Blackwood, the news spread quickly. On the night of October 31st, Jacob was ready, his camera rig and flashlight in hand, a wide grin plastered across his face. The live stream had already started, the comments rolling in, people cheering him on, warning him to stay safe, or egging him on to go deeper, find the real horrors within. Jacob had been inside dozens of supposedly haunted places, yet none had yielded anything significant, only faint sounds and dubious shadows. But Blackwood felt different. As he crossed the threshold, stepping through the towering double doors, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The cold air thickened, the silence becoming heavy, oppressive. The flashlight illuminated the vast, crumbling interior, revealing graffiti-smeared walls, peeling paint, and dust-covered furniture that looked like it hadn't been touched in a century. The comments kept coming in, viewers both intrigued and horrified by his venture into one of the state's most notorious haunted locations. "All right, folks," Jacob said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty hallway, "here we are. The infamous Blackwood Asylum. Legend has it that this place is haunted by the souls of patients who died during, well, let's just say less than legal experiments." He walked down the long, tiled hallway, the flashlight beam flickering as if in protest. To his left, a series of heavy, rusted doors lined the walls, each with a small window reinforced with iron bars. It was through these windows, he had read, that staff used to watch their patients, often without the patients ever knowing they were being observed. Jacob shuddered, imagining the eyes that had once looked out through those tiny, grimy panes, seeking freedom in the only way they knew how. A loud clang sounded from deep within the building, snapping Jacob's attention forward. His heart hammered. "Did you guys hear that?" he whispered into the camera, and he checked the comments again. They were lighting up, with viewers either laughing at his reaction or claiming they'd heard it too. He ventured onward, carefully stepping over debris, his footsteps muffled on the dust-laden floors. The air grew colder the farther he went, until he reached a stairwell leading down to the basement. It was pitch black below, and a sense of dread pooled in his gut, but he shook it off and took the first step, then the next, until he descended fully into the dark depths of Blackwood's lower level. The basement was where the real horrors were said to reside. In Blackwood's early days, the basement had been an experimental ward, filled with devices designed to cure patients through excruciatingly painful procedures. Lobotomies, electric shock therapy, isolation cells, methods intended to break down the psyche, render it malleable. What lingered here, in these hidden rooms, was said to be nothing short of monstrous. Jacob's flashlight swept over the walls, which were lined with ancient medical equipment, rusted and decayed, yet still bearing the haunting outline of what they once were. Stretched out restraints, torn and frayed, dangled from tables and chairs, their buckles rusted shut. As he moved deeper into the basement, a feeling of wrongness settled over him, as though the darkness was watching, waiting. A soft whisper seemed to drift from down the corridor. It was faint, almost like a child's voice. Jacob paused, his breath shallow, listening intently. Jacob, the voice was unmistakably his own name. He spun around, shining the flashlight behind him, yet there was nothing there, only the empty, yawning corridor stretching back toward the stairs. The comments exploded with messages, viewers asking if he'd heard the voice, if someone was with him. Jacob stammered a response, trying to laugh it off, but the unease gnawed at him. He could feel it, he wasn't alone. With each step, he could sense a presence creeping closer, lurking just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It was as though the shadows themselves were reaching out, their tendrils curling around his ankles, pulling him deeper into the belly of the asylum. The whispers grew louder, mingling into a chorus of voices, each one garbled, pleading, angry. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows across the walls. In that instant, he caught a glimpse of something at the end of the corridor. A figure, emaciated and distorted, stood there, its head tilted unnaturally, watching him with hollow, empty eyes. Jacob's breath hitched. He took a step back, then another, his mind racing. He stumbled, the flashlight tumbling from his hand and clattering to the floor. Scrambling, he grabbed it, but when he turned it back on, the figure was gone. Only silence greeted him, oppressive and thick, pressing down on him like a weight. Shakily, he continued on, driven by a morbid curiosity and the hundreds of viewers egging him on. He couldn't turn back now, not when he was so close. Yet, each step felt heavier, each breath harder to draw. The whispers returned, a cacophony of agony and despair, echoing off the walls, filling his head. Then he saw it, a door at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. On it was a plaque, the words barely visible beneath layers of dust, Dr. L. Whitmore, head of experimental research. He pushed the door open, revealing a room filled with bizarre machinery, wires snaking across the floor, and shelves lined with strange, glass containers. Some held murky liquid, others held things far worse, fingers, eyes, organs preserved in dusty jars. The walls were covered in pages torn from books, scribbled notes about transcendence and eternal consciousness. In the center of the room, something stirred. Jacob froze as he spotted a figure slumped over in a chair, its head bowed, hands bound with leather straps. The smell of rot was overwhelming, and he gagged, covering his mouth. Yet he couldn't tear his eyes away. He inched closer, the flashlight shaking in his grip. As he neared, he saw that the figure was skeletal, its skin dried and pulled taut over hollowed features. And then, without warning, its head snapped up, empty eyes boring into him, its jaw stretching open in a silent scream. Jacob stumbled back, horror coursing through his veins as the whispers grew deafening, filling the room with 1,000 agonized voices. The figure in the chair began to twitch, its limbs convulsing, jerking against the restraints as though something inside was trying to break free. He turned and ran, not caring about the debris or the noise, only needing to escape. The voices followed, growing louder, more insistent, filling his mind until it was a swirling storm of screams and wails. He darted back down the hallway, past rooms that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows reaching out as though to grasp him, pull him back. He could see the exit now, the dim outline of the stairs leading up to the main floor. His heart pounded as he raced toward it, every nerve in his body screaming to get out. But then, as he reached the stairwell, something grabbed his ankle. He fell hard, his chin slamming into the cold, tiled floor. Dazed, he twisted around, flashlight tumbling from his grasp. There, wrapped around his leg, was a hand, a skeletal, bony hand emerging from the shadows, its fingers digging into his skin. Jacob screamed, kicking desperately, his free leg pounding against the ground as he tried to wrench himself free. The grip tightened, icy and relentless, pulling him back toward the darkness. No. No. Let go, he shouted, his voice cracking, the terror raw and visceral. With one last desperate lunge, he kicked free, scrambling to his feet and sprinting up the stairs, heart hammering as he burst through the doors and out into the cold night air. He didn't stop running until he was halfway down the hill, the asylum looming behind him like a silent, malevolent sentinel. Finally, he collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, his body trembling. He looked back, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the broken window of the asylum, watching him, before it melted back into the shadows. When he checked his camera later, he found the footage had cut out the moment he'd entered the basement. All he had left were his own memories, and the faint bruise of skeletal fingers around his ankle, as though Blackwood Asylum had reached out from the past to remind him that some places are best left undisturbed. There's something strange about small towns tucked away in the woods. They hold secrets, concealed by shadows that grow thicker as the sun sinks beneath the horizon. Nestled deep within the vast expanse of pinewood forest was a place called Dark Hollow, a town that was erased from maps long ago, yet never truly abandoned. The world might have forgotten it, but Dark Hollow never forgot those who ventured too close. It was a late autumn evening when Rachel and her friends, Jenna, Eric, and Tom, found themselves driving down a narrow dirt road in search of a weekend getaway. They had booked a remote cabin near Pinewood Forest for some hiking and relaxation, hoping to escape the pressures of their mundane jobs. Little did they know, they were headed for something far more sinister. Rachel had always been the sensible one, the planner of the group. She sat in the passenger seat, staring at the GPS, which was beginning to glitch out. "It says we're close, but the signal keeps cutting," she muttered, glancing at Jenna, who was driving. "Maybe we took a wrong turn back there," Jenna replied, her eyes scanning the road ahead, which was growing darker by the minute. The trees loomed on either side like skeletal giants, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. Tom, in the back seat, yawned. "We should have just stayed at a hotel. I don't know why we had to pick a cabin in the middle of nowhere." "Because we wanted an adventure," Eric retorted, always the optimist. "And besides, I hear this forest has some crazy local legends. Supposedly haunted or something. It'll be fun." "Fun?" Rachel scoffed. "That's the last thing I want, getting scared out here in the dark with no cell service." Jenna suddenly slowed the car to a stop. "Look at this," she said, her voice tinged with confusion. Ahead of them, the road forked into two. The left path was blocked by an old rusted gate, with a sign hanging askew that read, "Dark Hollow, Private Property." The right path, according to the GPS, led to their cabin. "That's weird," Eric said, leaning forward. "Isn't Dark Hollow that ghost town? I heard about it on some urban legend forum. Apparently, the whole town disappeared overnight or something crazy like that." "I don't care what it is," Jenna said, pulling the car to the right. "We're not going anywhere near it. Let's just get to the cabin." As they drove away, Rachel couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered as they passed the gate. There was something about the name, Dark Hollow, that gnawed at her thoughts, though she couldn't remember why. The cabin was quaint but cozy. A fire crackled in the hearth as the group settled in for the evening, sipping wine and chatting about their plans for the weekend. Yet, despite the warmth and laughter, Rachel couldn't rid herself of the growing unease. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees like a mournful cry. Every once in a while, she would catch herself glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching them. "You're really quiet tonight," Jenna remarked, nudging Rachel. "Everything okay?" Rachel forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired from the drive, I guess." But her mind kept drifting back to the rusted gate, to the name on the sign. Dark Hollow. Later that night, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Rachel found herself wide awake. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. Something about Dark Hollow was calling to her, like a whisper just beyond her reach. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Slipping out of bed, she tiptoed down the stairs, careful not to wake anyone. She needed fresh air, to clear her head. Maybe a quick walk around the cabin would help her shake this unnerving feeling. Stepping outside, she was greeted by the chill of the autumn night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the landscape. The wind had died down, leaving the forest strangely still. Rachel wandered a short distance from the cabin, her footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. She could hear the distant rustle of animals in the underbrush, but something else caught her attention, a faint sound, almost imperceptible, like voices. She froze, straining her ears. There it was again. Faint, disembodied voices drifting through the trees. Her heart raced. She looked around, but the forest was empty, silent. Maybe it was just the wind, she told herself. But deep down, she knew better. The voices seemed to be coming from the direction of the rusted gate, the path to Dark Hollow. Rachel swallowed hard, her curiosity battling with her fear. She glanced back at the cabin, where her friends were fast asleep, oblivious to the strange sounds. For a moment, she considered waking them. But what would she say? That she was hearing things in the middle of the night? They'd laugh, tell her she was imagining it. No. She had to check this out on her own. Taking a deep breath, Rachel started toward the road, her heart pounding with every step. The voices grew louder as she neared the fork, though she still couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like a chorus of whispers, overlapping, disjointed, and pleading. When she reached the gate, she hesitated. The sign still hung there, swaying gently in the breeze, Dark Hollow, private property. A warning, or a challenge? Before she could second-guess herself, Rachel pushed open the gate. It creaked loudly, echoing through the empty woods. The path beyond was overgrown, the dirt road barely visible beneath a blanket of leaves and brambles. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The voices had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence that pressed down on her like a weight. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel reached the edge of the town. Dark Hollow lay before her, bathed in the eerie light of the moon. It was like stepping back in time, the buildings were old, crumbling, as if they had been abandoned for decades. Yet, there was something unnatural about the place. It was too still, too quiet. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the town square. The air was thick with the stench of decay. The windows of the buildings were dark, shattered, yet she could feel eyes watching her from every corner. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the empty streets. There was no sign of life, no birds, no insects, not even the wind dared to disturb this place. And then, she saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the square, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, cloaked in black, its face obscured by darkness. Rachel's blood turned to ice as the figure began to move toward her, slowly, deliberately. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the ground. The figure drew closer, its footsteps silent, its presence suffocating. Suddenly, the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing in her ears. They weren't just voices, they were screams. Agonized, desperate screams. Rachel's paralysis broke, and she stumbled backward, her heart racing in terror. She had to get out of here. She turned and ran, sprinting back the way she came, the screams chasing her through the forest. But as she reached the edge of town, something stopped her dead in her tracks. Standing in front of her, blocking the path, was another figure. This one was smaller, hunched over, its face twisted in a grotesque mask of pain. It reached out a hand to her, its skin pale and withered, its fingers long and bony. Rachel backed away, her mind spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But the pain in her chest was real, the cold sweat on her skin was real, and the terror gripping her heart was all too real. The figure took a step toward her, and Rachel bolted in the opposite direction, darting between the crumbling buildings. She had no idea where she was going, she just needed to escape. But the town was a maze, and no matter how far she ran, the figures kept appearing. Each one more twisted and monstrous than the last. Their screams filled the air, drowning out her thoughts, driving her to the brink of madness. Finally, Rachel stumbled into an alley, her chest heaving, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She collapsed against the wall, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The figures were closing in, their whispers filling her mind like a swarm of locusts. This was it. She was going to die here. But just as the darkness began to consume her, a familiar voice pierced through the cacophony. Rachel. She jerked her head up, her heart leaping in her chest. Jenna stood at the entrance to the alley, her face pale with fear. Behind her were Eric and Tom, their expressions mirroring her own. Without a word, they pulled Rachel to her feet and dragged her out of the alley, away from the figures, away from Dark Hollow. They ran through the forest, the screams fading behind them, until they finally reached the cabin. Only then did they stop, collapsing onto the porch in a heap of exhaustion. Rachel was shaking uncontrollably, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. What the hell was that? Jenna gasped, her voice trembling. I don't know, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. But we need to leave. Now. Without wasting another second, they packed their things and piled into the car. As they drove away, Rachel glanced back at the forest, her heart still racing. Dark Hollow was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. But the memory of that place, and the horrors it held, would haunt her forever. The group never spoke of that night again. They never told anyone what they had seen, what they had heard. It was as if the town had cursed them, leaving them with a secret they could never share. And though they never returned to Pinewood Forest, Rachel knew one thing for certain. Dark Hollow was still out there, waiting, watching, for the next soul foolish enough to stumble upon its forgotten streets. And it would never forget. Somewhere in the heart of New England, hidden beneath dense canopies of ancient trees, there lies a small town called Ashwood Grove. Cloaked in mist and mystery, this town is home to legends that locals dare not whisper too loudly, fearful they might invite something unwelcome. The story of Ashwood Grove wasn't written in books or newspapers, it was only ever told as a warning to stay far, far away. The story began when two sisters, Emily and Laura Thatcher, decided to spend a month in the old Thatcher family manor on the outskirts of Ashwood Grove. They had inherited the property after the recent passing of their grandmother, Elizabeth, who had spent her entire life in the house. Despite its eerie isolation, the sisters wanted to clear it out and decide whether to sell it. Neither of them had known Elizabeth well, yet they felt drawn to the house, compelled by an inexplicable urge to uncover their family's past. It was autumn, and as they drove up the winding path to the house, a thick fog rolled over the hills, shrouding the road. Shadows twisted in the mist, and strange noises seemed to echo from the woods. Laura, the younger sister, shivered as they neared the house. "Are you sure we should be doing this?" she asked, peering at the towering, decrepit mansion that loomed before them. Emily smiled, her confidence unwavering. "It's just an old house, Laura. Besides, it's ours now. We can't just leave it here to rot." The sisters stepped out of the car, staring at the manor. The house had once been grand but was now weathered and gray, its windows dark and hollow. Ivy clung to the walls, twisting up the stone like veins, and the front door creaked ominously as they opened it. The stale, musty air hit them immediately, and a strange chill settled around them. They spent the day unpacking and cleaning, exploring the dusty rooms filled with outdated furniture and family heirlooms. Yet, as night fell, the house seemed to come alive. Every shadow deepened, every sound echoed longer than it should have. The wind outside picked up, howling like a distant wail, and strange creaks reverberated through the walls. That first night, as they were getting ready for bed, Laura noticed something strange, a dusty old mirror leaning against the wall of the guest bedroom. She couldn't remember seeing it there earlier. "Hey, Emily," she called, her voice shaking slightly. "Did you put this mirror here?" Emily came to the doorway, frowning at the mirror. "No. I didn't. It's probably been here forever." "Why?" "I don't know. Something about it feels wrong." Emily shrugged, brushing off Laura's unease. "It's just a mirror. Come on, let's get some sleep." That night, Laura had her first nightmare. She dreamed of the mirror, but in her dream, it wasn't just a mirror, it was a doorway. Dark, twisted figures writhed behind the glass, pressing their faces against it, their eyes hollow and hungry. One by one, they reached out their hands, clawing at the glass as if trying to escape. She awoke with a start, her heart racing, her skin drenched in cold sweat. She sat up, panting, and glanced around the room, half expecting to see the figures from her dream staring back at her. But the room was empty. Just the mirror, its dark glass reflecting her pale face. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the house. Objects disappeared, only to reappear in different rooms. Cold spots appeared in random places, and both sisters heard strange whispers echoing through the halls, though they could never make out the words. One afternoon, as they were cleaning out the attic, Laura found an old journal bound in cracked, weathered leather. She opened it carefully, flipping through its brittle pages. It was filled with scrawled handwriting, notes written by Elizabeth herself. One entry caught her eye. It was dated October 1954. "I've seen it again in the mirror. The shadow with no face. It watches me as I sleep, standing in the corner of the room. I fear it is growing closer each night." Laura's hands trembled as she read further. Elizabeth had written about nightmares and shadows, of seeing things in the mirror that she could not explain. She wrote of feeling like something was waiting, watching her from the other side. "Emily," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. I think Grandma was afraid of something in this house." Emily brushed it off, though her own unease was starting to show. "Laura, Grandma was old. She probably just imagined things. She was alone out here for so long." But the nightmares only grew worse. Each night, Laura would dream of the mirror, of the shadowy figures pressing against the glass. They would claw and scratch, their voices muffled but desperate, like something trapped. Each morning, she would wake up feeling weaker, as if something was draining her energy. Then one night, Laura awoke with a start to find herself staring at the mirror. But this time, she wasn't dreaming. A dark figure stood in the reflection, half hidden in shadows, its head cocked at an unnatural angle as it watched her. Its eyes were hollow voids, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. The figure moved closer, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out of the mirror, inching toward her. Just as its hand grazed her skin, Laura managed to tear her gaze away and scrambled out of bed, running from the room. She burst into Emily's room, sobbing, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Emily, please. There's something in the mirror, it tried to grab me." Emily's face paled, but she tried to calm her sister. "Laura, you're exhausted. These nightmares, they're just getting to you. Maybe we should leave for a few days, clear our heads." The following day, they packed their bags, ready to leave. But as they were locking the front door, Laura's eye caught a glint of light from the mirror in the guest room, now visible from the hallway. It had moved. The mirror now stood directly in front of the door, as if daring them to leave. Emily noticed it too, her hand trembling as she clutched the doorknob. "We didn't put it there, did we?" Laura shook her head, terror filling her. "We have to go. Now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, locking them inside. A sudden, deafening silence fell over the house. The air grew thick and heavy, and a chill settled over them. And then, slowly, the whispers returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls, through the floor, through the very air they breathed. Laura clung to Emily, her voice barely a whisper. "We're not alone, Emily. Something is here with us." The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. Shadows twisted and moved, crawling across the walls, their shapes contorted and unnatural. The sisters backed away from the mirror, but it was as if it followed them. Its reflection twisted and warped, and then, slowly, the glass began to ripple, as though it were made of water. Faces appeared in the mirror, dozens of them, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their expressions twisted in agony. Emily screamed as one of the figures pressed its hand against the glass, then another, and another, until the mirror was filled with reaching hands, all desperate to escape. Laura's voice trembled. "They're trapped. They're trapped in the mirror." The largest figure, the one with the hollow eyes and skeletal fingers, pressed closer, and the whispers turned to screams. It clawed at the glass, its face inches away from theirs, its mouth opening wider, wider, until it was a black hole. Suddenly, the glass shattered, and the figures poured out, shadows that twisted and writhed, filling the room with darkness. The sisters screamed, scrambling for the door, but the shadows clawed at them, icy fingers wrapping around their wrists, pulling them back toward the mirror. Emily and Laura fought, but the shadows were too strong. Their screams echoed through the empty halls as they were dragged into the mirror, their reflections disappearing into the glass. Days later, the townspeople found the house abandoned. They searched every room, every corner, but there was no sign of the sisters. The only thing they found was an old mirror, covered in a thin layer of dust, its surface cold to the touch. Sometimes, on cold autumn nights, if you stand in front of that mirror, you might see them, two young women, their faces twisted in terror, their hands pressed against the glass, silently begging for release. But once you see them, the shadows begin to notice you. And if you stand there too long, listening to the whispers, you might find yourself drawn closer and closer. Until one day, your reflection doesn't look like you at all. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies a place that locals know simply as the Blackwoods. Few dare venture there, and fewer still speak openly of the horrors that dwell within. The trees are thick, ancient things that twist and reach like skeletal fingers against the sky, shrouding the forest floor in darkness even on the brightest days. It was said that anyone who entered the Blackwoods at night was unlikely to return. But every now and then, some unlucky soul was tempted to defy the legend, and many never came back. This was a story that 12-year-old Tommy Ray knew well. His family had lived in Blackwood County for generations, and he had heard tales about the forest since he was old enough to walk. His grandfather, Old Joe, used to warn him about it, saying that something evil lingered in those trees. And he had seen the proof himself. One cold October evening, just days before Halloween, Tommy overheard his father, Daniel, arguing with his older sister, Lily. Lily, who had just turned 17, was all defiance in attitude. She rolled her eyes as her father spoke. "Lily, I don't want you going near those woods, you hear me?" Daniel's voice was firm, but it wavered with worry. "Dad, I'm not a little kid anymore. It's just a bunch of trees," Lily scoffed. Tommy watched from the staircase, a sick feeling in his stomach. He knew Lily was planning to sneak into the Blackwoods with some friends as a Halloween dare. It was a tradition for local teens to venture just inside the woods, drink a beer or two, and tell ghost stories to see who would get scared first. But this year, something about it felt wrong. Later that night, when the house was dark and quiet, Tommy slipped out of bed. He crept down the stairs and into the kitchen, where he found his dad sitting alone, staring into a glass of whiskey. Tommy approached him cautiously. "Dad," he whispered. Daniel looked up, startled. "Tommy, what are you doing up?" Tommy hesitated. He had never seen his father look so troubled. "Do you think something bad will happen to Lily?" His father sighed deeply, glancing toward the darkened window. "Son, those woods aren't right. They've never been right. People talk about the ghosts, but it's not ghosts I'm worried about. It's the things that are still alive in there." "What things?" Tommy asked, his curiosity mixed with dread. His father's face went pale, and he didn't answer. Instead, he just whispered, "Get back to bed, Tommy. Don't you worry about Lily. I'll make sure she doesn't go near those woods." But the next morning, Lily was gone. Her bed was empty, her phone left on the nightstand, and her room was untouched. Daniel searched everywhere, frantically calling her friends and family, but no one knew where she was. The police were called, and soon the entire town was scouring the countryside, looking for any sign of her. Tommy felt a heavy weight in his chest, an overwhelming sense that he would never see his sister again. Days passed without a trace of Lily. Daniel grew more desperate, spending every night at the edge of the Blackwoods, calling her name into the darkness until his voice was hoarse. But the forest remained silent, as if swallowing his pleas whole. And then, on the 5th night after her disappearance, a strange noise filled the town, a low, mournful wail that echoed from the depths of the Blackwoods. It wasn't a human scream, but a chilling, otherworldly sound that raised the hairs on everyone's necks. Daniel knew it was time. He had no choice, he had to go into the Blackwoods. Tommy watched as his father gathered supplies, an old hunting rifle, a flashlight, and a rope. His face was set in a grim expression that made Tommy's stomach twist with fear. "Dad," he whispered, his voice small. "Please don't go. Please." Daniel knelt down and put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Son, I have to. Lily's in there somewhere. I can feel it. And I'm going to bring her back." He hugged Tommy tightly, then turned and walked out the door without another word. Tommy ran to the window and watched his father's figure disappear into the misty trees, his flashlight a small, wavering point of light swallowed by the darkness. Hours passed, and Tommy sat alone in the house, clutching an old quilt for warmth. The night stretched on, and outside, the forest loomed, its shadows seeming to press closer to the house. He tried to stay awake, to listen for any sign of his father's return, but exhaustion soon overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. In his dreams, he saw Lily. She stood in a clearing, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. Shadows twisted around her, and she reached out toward him, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Behind her, figures moved in the darkness, figures with long, spindly limbs and eyes that gleamed like molten gold. Tommy woke with a start, his heart pounding. The house was silent, but a strange feeling prickled at the back of his neck, a feeling that he was not alone. He got out of bed, his feet cold against the wooden floor, and tiptoed to the window. The forest was darker than ever, but in the distance, he saw something moving between the trees, a flicker of light, like a flashlight. "Dad," he whispered, hope flaring in his chest. He waited, watching the light move closer, weaving through the trees in an erratic, almost desperate path. As it drew nearer, he could see that it was indeed his father, his face drawn and haggard. But something was wrong. Daniel was stumbling, his steps unsteady, and his eyes were wild, as if he had seen things that no one should ever see. Tommy rushed to the door, flinging it open just as his father stumbled up the porch steps. "Dad," he cried, reaching out to steady him. Daniel grabbed Tommy's arm, his grip cold and trembling. "Tommy, get inside. Lock the doors. They're coming." Who's coming?" Daniel didn't answer. He pushed Tommy inside and slammed the door, locking it and dragging a heavy cabinet in front of it. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his eyes darted around the room, as if expecting something to break through the walls at any moment. "Dad, what happened? Where's Lily?" Daniel shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. I couldn't find her. She's one of them now." Tommy's heart sank. One of what? Daniel closed his eyes, and a haunted look settled over his face. "The Blackwood Takers. They're not human. They're ancient, things that shouldn't exist. I thought it was just a legend, a story, but I saw them." He began to sob, his shoulders shaking. "I tried to bring her back, but she's part of them now. And they're coming for me, for us." As he spoke, a heavy silence fell over the room, punctuated by soft, scraping sounds from outside the house. Tommy's heart raced as he looked at the window, where faint shadows moved in the darkness, closing in. "Get upstairs, Tommy," Daniel whispered, his face pale. "Now." Tommy didn't hesitate. He ran upstairs, his mind spinning with terror. He crouched in a corner of his room, his back pressed against the wall as he listened to the noises below, the thudding footsteps, the creak of wood, the soft murmur of voices that weren't quite human. Then, everything went silent. For a moment, he thought it was over, that maybe the creatures had left. But then he heard something, a low, whispering voice calling his name from outside the window. "Tommy." It was Lily's voice, soft and pleading. "Tommy, please, help me." He stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew it couldn't be her. His father had said she was gone, that she was part of them now. But the voice, it sounded so real, so desperate. "Tommy," the voice grew louder, more insistent. Against every instinct, he crept toward the window and looked outside. There, standing beneath the trees, was Lily. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes wide and empty, but her lips twisted into a pleading smile. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice hollow and distant. "Come outside. I need you." He backed away, his chest tight with fear, but something kept him rooted in place, unable to turn away from her gaze. Slowly, her face began to change. Her eyes darkened, her mouth stretched wider, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. She reached out a hand toward him, her fingers twisting and elongating into claw-like talons. Tommy stumbled back, his throat tight with terror. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. "Come to us, Tommy," she hissed, her voice now layered with other voices, all whispering in unison. "Join us, be one of us." He scrambled to his bed, pulling the blankets over his head as he tried to block out the sound of the voices, the soft scratching at the window. But they didn't stop. They grew louder, filling his ears, his mind, until he thought he would go mad. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the voices fell silent. He lay there in the darkness, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. Slowly, he lowered the blanket, peeking out from beneath it. The room was empty, and the house was silent. But outside, beyond the window, he could still see the shadows waiting, watching, their eyes glinting with a hunger that would never fade. The Blackwoods had taken Lily. And now, Tommy knew, they were waiting to take him too.